Montana Territory, autumn of 1872. The wind blew sharp through the streets of Red Rock Crossing, and the townsfolk went still as the sheriff dragged the chained woman down Main Street. She stumbled, wrists bound in iron, a long streak of dried blood down one temple. Dust clung to her boots and the torn hem of her skirt. Her eyes were fierce, not pleading, dark like whetstone. She walked upright, even as the chain pulled against her arms. Sheriff Doolin barked at the bystanders, "Step aside. This one's heading to the holding pit till her ransom's paid. Anyone asks questions, they can join her." Nobody said a word. From the far end of the street, a tall man stepped off the porch of the saloon, eyes locked on the woman in chains. He wore a battered hat low over his brow, a rifle slung across his back, and carried himself like a man who had seen war and walked away from it. His name was Gideon McCall, a cowboy turned cattleman with calloused hands and a reputation for keeping to himself. Gideon's bootsteps echoed on the wooden planks as he came closer. He stopped when he reached the middle of the street, just as the woman was dragged past. Her eyes flicked to him, just for a second. And in that second, something shifted. "What's the charge?" Gideon asked calmly, voice low but grounded. "She stole from the bank," Sheriff Doolin snapped. "Tried to run off with 300 in silver. We caught her just east of the ridge." Gideon looked to the woman again. She said nothing. Her lip was busted and her blouse was torn at the shoulder, but she stood like someone who would never beg for anything. "What's her name?" Gideon asked. "Orla Halloway," the sheriff muttered. "No family. No one to pay the ransom. $500 for release." Gideon's jaw tensed. 500 was a steep price, near all he had saved from the last cattle drive. But she did not look like a thief. She looked like someone who had run out of choices. He watched her get dragged down the street and disappear behind the jailhouse doors. That night, Gideon tossed in his bunk, staring at the ceiling of his small cabin outside town. The girl's face would not leave him, not the blood on her temple, not the way she held herself in those chains like they did not own her. By dawn, he was saddled and riding into town. He walked into the sheriff's office with the sun still low on the horizon. "I am paying her ransom," Gideon said, dropping a leather satchel onto the desk. 500. Sheriff Doolin looked up slowly, eyes narrowing. "You have no idea what she is, McCall. You think she is some girl who needs saving? I think what I do with my money is my business." The sheriff chewed on that for a moment, then grunted and opened the cell door. Orla sat on the floor, arms wrapped around her knees. Her wrists were bruised from the chains. She looked up when the door opened, blinking at the sunlight behind Gideon's frame. "You are free," the sheriff muttered, unlocking her cuffs. She winced as the iron came off, rubbing her wrists slowly. Gideon did not speak. He just stepped aside and waited. She stood, straight-backed, and walked past the sheriff. When she reached Gideon, she stopped. "Why?" she asked. "Because I believed you did not belong in that cage." Orla looked him over, like she was trying to decide if he was real. "You just threw away $500. I had no use for it," Gideon said. "But if you like, you can repay me in time." She tilted her head. "How? I have land, a cabin, a few head of cattle, and no one to cook or help mend fence or keep me from talking to myself. You want me to work it off?" "I want a second pair of hands," Gideon said. "And I figured you would rather be useful than running from whatever had you out there stealing silver." She stared at him for a long second, then nodded. "All right, but I am not cooking," she said. Gideon smiled just a little. "Then we will both go hungry." They rode out of town together that morning, quiet between them. The prairie opened wide and golden around them. It took them 3 hours to reach Gideon's cabin, a small, but well-kept place tucked against a line of cottonwoods, with a smokehouse out back and a small corral for the livestock. Orla did not ask questions. She rolled up her sleeves and started hauling water from the creek, then helped stack firewood. She moved like someone used to hard work. Gideon watched her from the porch, something unspoken curling in his chest. That night, she sat by the fire in his cabin, her fingers working a torn sleeve with needle and thread. "You really think I stole from that bank?" she asked, eyes fixed on the cloth. "I think you needed something badly," Gideon said. "I needed train fare. Where were you running to? I was not running, she said quietly. I was going after someone. Gideon waited. She did not offer more. He nodded once. If you ever want to talk about it, I will listen. Orla looked up at him, and her expression softened for the first time. You are different, she said. Maybe. She leaned back in her chair, firelight casting soft shadows across her tired face. I will stay, she said. For a while. Gideon nodded. Good. And something shifted between them, quiet but steady like the first warmth of spring after a long winter. He looked at her and she looked back. Neither of them smiled. But something about that silence felt like the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Morning light filtered through the cottonwoods, casting long shadows across the frost-hardened ground. Orla stepped outside the cabin wrapped in a wool shawl, her breath rising in small clouds. She crossed to the lean-to where Gideon was hammering a loose board into place on the feed shelter. You've got a draft coming in through the west wall, she said, nodding toward the side. I know, Gideon replied, straightening. Tried to patch it last winter. Didn't hold. Orla walked the length of the structure, then crouched at the corner, running her fingers along the base. You have spare canvas? In the barn. Why? I can sew a windbreak into the inside wall. It'll hold better than nailing more wood. He studied her a moment, then nodded once. I'll fetch it. She didn't speak as he walked off. Her hands had already found the right stones to weigh down the corners. She worked quickly, efficiently, and when Gideon returned with the canvas roll under one arm and a coil of twine in the other, she took them without comment and set to measuring. By the time the sun crested fully over the ridge, the windbreak was half done. Inside the cabin later, Orla traced a finger along a map pinned beside the stove. Pencil marks dotted the Montana ranges. These yours? Gideon glanced up from the table where he was repairing a saddle girth. Yeah. Mapped the grazing lines myself. That southern stretch is no good past September. You go that far? Sometimes. Depends on the water. She let her hand fall to her side. I used to travel with someone who kept a journal like that. He marked trees, though. Not ridges. Gideon wiped his hands on a cloth. You lose him? She didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, he didn't come back from Wyoming territory. Left in the spring. Said he was going after a man who owed him $50 and a broken promise. You followed. I waited. Then I followed. He didn't press. That evening, a storm rolled down from the hills, nothing violent, just the kind that settled heavy over the land and made the fire inside the cabin burn brighter. They sat by the hearth, each with a mug of coffee. Orla's eyes tracked the flames, her voice low. He wasn't my blood, but he raised me like I was. Taught me how to ride, how to read the land. When he didn't come back, I sold what I could and went after him. Didn't plan on ending up in a jail pit. You still looking for him? No. I found a man in Rawlins who saw him fall off his horse outside Laramie. Fever took him. They buried him under a sycamore. Gideon didn't look away. I'm sorry. I'm not. He died chasing something worth chasing. That's more than most get. Gideon leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You staying out here to forget? No, she met his eyes. I'm staying because I got tired of not knowing what came next. He nodded once, as if that made perfect sense. After a while, she stood and added another log to the fire. Her movements were unhurried, as though she'd done it 100 times before. I'll sleep in the loft, she said. It's cold up there. I've slept colder. I'll leave the ladder down. She paused at the base of the steps, glancing back at him. You always this decent? No, he said. But I try. Orla climbed the ladder without another word. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters gently. Gideon sat alone for a while, staring into the fire, the quiet pressing in around him. He did not reach for his rifle. He did not pour another drink. He simply sat, knowing that for the first time in a long while, someone else was under his roof, and the silence no longer felt like something to endure. Upstairs, Orla curled beneath the heavy quilt. She listened to the timbers creak, to the faint sound of a man below who asked for nothing and expected less. She closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she did not dream of running. The first snow came quiet, falling in the early hours before dawn. Gideon found the cabin steps dusted white when he stepped out with the feed pail, his breath rising steady in the still air. The horses nosed at the frost-crusted hay, and the fences creaked under the weight of cold. Inside, Orla had already stirred the fire back to life and was grinding corn by hand, sleeves rolled high, her fingers red from washing in the icy basin water. She didn't speak when he came in, only passed him a half loaf of yesterday's bread. They ate standing, boots wet, the silence between them full but not heavy. Later, Gideon saddled the roan and took it south to check the creek line fencing. It was near mid-afternoon when he returned and found Orla high on the ladder beside the smokehouse, hammering new shingles into place. "You climb roofs often?" he asked, tying off the reins. "Only when the roof leaks," she said, not looking down. He stood below, watching her, arms folded. "If you fall and break your neck, I'll have to drag you inside and pretend I never saw you." "You'd bury me first," she said, driving a nail. He didn't argue. She came down steady, handing him the hammer without a word. That evening, she watched him carve strips of venison for drying. Her voice came quiet from the corner. "You always live this far out?" "Since the war ended." "You fight?" He nodded once. She studied him. "You lose anyone?" "My older brother." "Chickamauga." Orla looked toward the window. "I used to dream about battles when I was small. Thought they were like stories. They aren't." She didn't answer, just pulled her shawl tighter. After supper, she lingered by the fire, eyes on the flames again, but different this time, less distant. Her hands rested idle in her lap. "There's a man in town who knows what I did before they chained me," she said. Gideon leaned back in his chair. "You worried he'll talk?" "He won't. But it matters what you think." He didn't look away. "Whatever you did, you're not that now." She stood and crossed to the hearth, staring down into the coals. "I worked cards in saloons. Not the kind of place a girl walks out of clean." "You walked out." "I ran," she said. "And I don't know if I'm done running." Gideon stood too slow. "You're not running now." She turned. Her face was unreadable in the firelight, but her voice was steady. "You brought me here without asking anything in return." "I didn't need anything in return." Orla stepped closer. "But I want to give it." He reached her then, not sudden, not dramatic, just a hand lifted, fingers brushing her cheek with the gentlest care. Her eyes closed under the touch. "I don't know how to be soft anymore," she whispered. "You don't have to be," he said. "You just have to stay." Her forehead rested against his chest, his arms circling her like he'd been waiting to hold something breakable and real. They stood there a long while, no words left between them. The fire cracked. The snow kept falling. And for the first time since the day she'd been dragged through town in chains, Orla let herself feel warm. A week passed with the snow deepening in quiet layers, the world narrowing to the space between the barn, the cabin, and the line of trees where the wind always shifted first. Orla rose before the sun most days, sometimes already dressed when Gideon came in from checking the traps. They fell into rhythm not out of habit but instinct. On a morning when the frost clung thick to the window glass, Gideon came in carrying a rabbit, his coat damp from melting snow. "We're low on salt," he said, setting it on the table. "And the axe handle's cracked. I'll need to make the ride in." Orla looked up from where she was mending the lining of his coat. "You trust me to stay here alone?" He nodded as he hung his rifle by the door. "There's nothing here worth stealing. And nothing out there I think you're chasing anymore." She didn't argue. Her needle moved through the fabric as she asked, "You planning to be back before sundown?" "If the trail's clear. If not, I'll sleep in the livery. I've done worse." She folded the coat when she finished, hands lingering a moment on the stitched seams. "If you don't come back, I'll take the horse and follow the tracks." He looked at her, then really looked, and something in his chest pulled taut. "You'd come after me?" "I'm not leaving things half set anymore." By noon, he was gone, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. The cabin held a strange stillness in his absence, not hollow, but waiting. Orla moved through the hours with steady purpose, splitting kindling, boiling lard for the lanterns, brushing the mare's coat until it gleamed like riverstone. Near dusk, a knock came, sharp and fast. She opened the door with her hand already near the pistol by the stove. A boy stood in the snow, no older than 12, his cheeks raw from wind. He held out a folded scrap of paper. Sheriff said give this to the woman at the McCall place. Orla took it, squinting in the waning light. The boy didn't wait, turned and ran before she could ask more. The note was smudged, but she could make out the handwriting. It wasn't Gideon's. McCall's in the jailhouse. Come quiet, no law but me tonight. She stood very still, the paper softening in her grip from the damp. She didn't panic. She packed. By full dark, she was on Gideon's roan, riding hard down the ridge trail. The sky was heavy with cloud, but no snow fell. The wind pressed low through the trees as she rode. Red Rock Crossing was quieter than usual, the saloon shuttered, the lanterns fewer. She left the horse in the alley behind the blacksmith's shed and slipped down the back path to the jailhouse. The front was lit, but the side window was dark. She crouched beneath it and listened. Inside, she heard a voice, Doolin's, low and sure. You were warned, McCall. You don't buy prisoners off me without consequence. Gideon's voice came rough but unbowed. She wasn't yours to sell. Orla moved to the back door and tested it. Unlocked. She slipped inside. The office was empty. A lantern burned low on the desk. Through the doorway to the cells, she saw Doolin's back, blocking the bars. She stepped forward, silent as dusk. Move, she said. Doolin turned, startled, his hand going to his belt. But she already had her pistol out, steady in both hands. You think you've got the law behind you? He sneered. No, she said. But I've got nothing to lose. His eyes narrowed, but he stepped back. Gideon stood behind the bars, jaw bruised, hands bound. Keys, she said. Doolin reached slowly into his coat and tossed them to the ground. She didn't bend to pick them up. Slide them with your boot. He did. She kept the pistol trained on him while Gideon knelt, unlocked the cuffs, then the cell door. You all right? She asked him. I've had worse. You always say that. He stood fully then, taller than Doolin, blood drying along the side of his neck. We're leaving, she said. Doolin didn't move. You try anything, she added, and I'll bury you so deep the worms'll need a map. They walked out into the cold, Gideon leaning a little heavier on her than he meant to. Once they were clear, once the horse was beneath him and she was leading them back into the hills, he said, You came. She looked up at him through the falling dark. You think I'd let someone drag you through town in chains? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Back at the cabin, she helped him down, guided him inside, and set to cleaning the cut near his brow. You're stubborn, she said. You're worse, he muttered. She smiled then, faint but real. You're mine now. He caught her hand before she could pull away. I want to be. Outside, the snow finally began to fall again, gentle, steady, covering the trail behind them. Come spring, the ice melted from the creek first. Then the wind shifted, softer through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of wet earth instead of snow. Orla stood barefoot at the edge of the garden bed, sleeves pushed up, dirt under her nails as she pressed seeds into rows she'd planned by memory, not measure. Beside her, Gideon drove fencing deeper along the south pasture, his shirt stuck to his back, his shoulders darkened by sun. They hadn't spoken much about the night in town. There'd been no need. They returned and they stayed. That was enough. Orla wiped the back of her wrist across her brow. We'll need a second hoe if I'm going to keep this up. I'll trade for one in 2 days, Gideon called across the yard. Heading into Copper Hollow for horse feed. Could use more muslin too, she said. I've near worn through what I have patching your shirts. He leaned on the fence post, watching her. You want to come? She paused, half-crouched. You mean ride into town with you? I mean ride into town as mine. She straightened up slowly. That what I am? Gideon didn't look away. That's what I want. She didn't answer, but she didn't look uncertain. That night she laid her hand on his chest before sleep, and he covered it with his own, weathered and warm. 2 days later, they crossed the ridge trail together, the roan under Gideon and the paint mare under Orla, packs light but well tied. The road into Copper Hollow curved through low hills where wild plum trees had started to bloom pale and soft. By the time they reached the edge of town, Gideon dismounted and helped Orla down without a word between them. The general store sat near the livery, its porch swept clean, a stack of flour sacks leaning in the shade. Inside, Orla ran a hand along the bolts of cloth, pausing at a faded blue cotton with tiny white flowers. She held it up without turning. "I could make a dress from this." He nodded. "You should." The storekeep, a lean man with a silver watch chain, cleared his throat. "You folks from over the ridge?" "McCall homestead," Gideon said. "We're set up past the cottonwood draw." The man nodded, measuring the cloth. "That's a good stretch of land." "You two keep it yourselves." Gideon looked to Orla. She met his eyes. "We do," she said. On the way back, they stopped near the waterline where the trees grew close. Orla stepped off the trail, kneeling near the edge, dipping her hand into the runoff. She looked over her shoulder. "I want to build something back there, near the stream." "What kind of something?" "Smokehouse, maybe? Or a shed. Somewhere to keep herbs dry come summer." "I've been thinking on it." He crouched beside her, watching her fingertips trace the cold water. "You've been making plans." She nodded. "I want this to be mine too. Not just a place I work in. A place I belong to." "You do," he said. She turned to him fully then. "I want to marry you, Gideon McCall." His brow lifted, but there was no surprise in his face. "You sure?" "I've never been more." He took her hand, rough palmed to her calloused fingers. "Then let's make it right." They married under a cottonwood with no preacher, no paper, just hands joined and words spoken. She wore the blue dress she'd sewn herself. He carved a ring from a piece of bone and slid it onto her finger. The neighbors from the far ridges came when word spread. There was stew and cornbread and coffee boiled strong in a tin kettle. Someone played fiddle. Someone danced. Orla laughed until her sides hurt, her head resting against Gideon's chest when the fire burned down to coals. Years passed. The garden grew. The fences held. The shed near the stream became a drying house with bundles of sage and yarrow hung from the beams. Gideon bought more cattle. Orla took in women from the back trails sometimes, ones with bruised mouths or hands that shook. She taught them how to plant, how to boil soap, how to stay. One summer brought blight to the tomatoes. One winter the barn caught fire and they rebuilt it together, side by side in the frost. They never left the land. In the evenings, Gideon read from a Bible his brother had carried through the war. Orla stitched by lantern light, her head resting against his shoulder when her fingers tired. They never spoke of the years before, not because they couldn't, but because what they had made now was strong enough to stand on its own. And when the first child came, a girl with her mother's dark eyes and her father's quiet steadiness, they named her Sycamore for the tree where someone once laid a good man to rest, and where another found the courage to begin again. The night she was born, Gideon held her to his chest beside the fire and looked at Orla, exhausted and smiling. "You saved me," he said. She closed her eyes and whispered, "We saved each other." And they did. For all the years that followed, in every season that came.